Da 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 da! What's my good cheer? Welcome, welcome, everybody. Let's give YouTube a couple of minutes, get those notifications out. In the meantime, if you've never popped into one of my lives, hi, I'm Cindy. I explore the inside and the outside. And, I am very casual. I come here, and for the most part, I want this to be a comfortable process for myself because I know the more comfortable I feel in expressing myself, my emotions, those experiences in my life, some of those lessons that I'm picking up along the way that I don't think that are just necessarily important for me, but if they're important for me, they've got to be important for other people. I do shadow work, you guys. I do it casually, I do it comfortably. Lots of times we can cause ourselves anxiety. Even for myself, when I woke up to some of these ideas, I had no idea what to expect. And I tell you, I have a very creative mind, and my mind went all over the places, right? And it is true. If you heard that phrase, it's about peeling off the layers of the onion and just to reveal, right, who we really are. Because a lot of it is just coping mechanisms. Lots of it, and almost all of it also, is just the habit of the way we live, right? If you're anything like me, you're highly sensitive, right? You're very introspective. You probably kind of isolate yourself a little bit because through your experiences, maybe you realize that you don't rub up to others in the world, in the space that you hold. And sometimes it's just easier just to live in your own world and making yourself your own. It's not necessarily your own best friend because I didn't even recognize I had my own best friend. But I was so determined, and I truly felt that I had been wronged in some way. I don't know why I was offered up that little bit of gift to actually recognize intent. But I never thought I had any control over it. You know, I grew up in a household that said, it was just part of our upbringing to turn the other cheek. And I did the very best that I could. And I understood if I could turn the other cheek, lots of times I could avert emotional, physical, mental discomfort. And that was the truth. But also in feeling the intent, you know, when my dad was angry, he used to bite his tongue, and that's how we used to know he was upset. He never yelled at us, never raised a hand to us in his entire life, but he was able to let us know how upset he was, or there was something for us to reflect in our actions what we had done, right? Because that was his signal that he was angry. And for me, lots of times I had a hard time. And sometimes in turning that cheek, I would just go, oh, right? It would just be so obvious that I was fighting that. And that would cause it. And once that was caught, what was that was recognized, like I would get pulled into that more often, more often than not. This week, I thought maybe we would talk about guilt and shame because it was a steering wheel in my life. I was brought up in a household where a lot of my movement was steered that way, to make me feel bad so I wouldn't do something, or make me feel bad so that I would do something, or just to make me feel bad so that somebody else could feel a little bit better. And that was that was true too. Growing up, I really felt bad. I felt that rub. I felt that intent, but also, right, growing up in that era of kids should be seen and not heard. Right, it was a lot of that. If you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. And again, in not wanting to rub people wrong, I just kept to myself, kept my ideas to myself, and in feeling the intent, right, I isolated myself, even as a child. There was a lot of distrust built into that. And yeah, sometimes we can't help the upbringings that we have. We don't really get a say. We don't get any kind of uh, I'm trying to think, because you don't get any say when you're a child, because you're just following the directive and you're being taught, right? By your parents and your aunts and your uncles. And you know lots of us can grow up and have a loving, nurturing, educational, well-rounded, well-balanced life, and still be missing out, right? Some of those very important aspects of being a human being, like resilience, bravery, courage, right? A lot of these things that are only built through discomfort and hardship. These are ideas I didn't grow up with, but somehow, I felt my way around in that, and I knew my place in the world, right? Felt very shameful as a child. And again, I wanted to talk about guilt and shame this week, and I was looking for examples. And I just made one up. It wasn't easy. I'm creative. I could just make up a story, and I made up a story in my mind as a good example as for guilt, right? But I wanted my one of my experiences in shame to be the example story for shame. And so I was going back into some of those experiences in my childhood, my early adulthood and stuff. And every time I hit the topic of shame, the spirit, oh, that one, oh, that was so bad. I felt, right? I would get shut down on that because I would recognize that it was actually guilt for the very first time. An experience that in my childhood or young adulthood that I just associated with shame. I just accepted it was shameful. It was something in me that, right, like I wasn't worthy, that I was right, and everything in my life seemed to compound that. But when I was looking for that experience in my own life, I recognized that a lot of those experiences that I associated with shame were actually just guilt. Now, there is a difference between guilt and shame. You personally will feel the shame. It's a different character altogether, a different part of you that feels shame, because shame is something that right? You know it. It's just not something that was projected onto you, right? It wasn't something that was just guilt tripped guilt tripped onto you. It wasn't something that somebody said like fatso or you're ugly or you're stupid or you're late. It wasn't anything like that. It was probably an unkindness. It was a lie. It was letting yourself down, right? So when I was thinking about these examples for guilt and shame, I was thinking about, I didn't turn the other cheek. I was brought up to turn the other cheek. Every time somebody did something bad to me, said something mean, right? Not to bud my nose into disagreements that other people were having. And I thought about that, and just now thinking about that, I was just, oh my goodness, right? I felt very shameful because I couldn't turn the other cheek when I felt the intent. Because, I knew somebody really meant to do me harm, whether it was emotionally, physically, or mentally. And I just had a realization of a shame, a really bad shame that I had. And I just realized in trying to come up with that it was actually a guilt also. But I held so much of that in my life. But the guilt, you guys, we feel guilty, right? You bump in, I'm a Canadian. We bump into somebody. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, right? I didn't mean that. And that's the intent, right? When we make a choice and we've hurt emotionally, physically, or mentally somebody else, that is worthy of feeling shame in that. And that's not to say you're shameful, you're terrible, you're mean, but to recognize the accountability in that. To recognize like truly you misstepped, you misjudged, if you're judging it all, right? That you actually did damage and you didn't do good by somebody or something. And yeah, that can be shame, but that's when you forgive yourself and you offer up that forgiveness for others too, right? Who play in that story. But there's a lot like today when I was in between my day, right? I was thinking about the shame, and there was so many things and I could not grasp onto anything truly that really felt like shame, right? And I came up with one, and it was so weak. It was, right? But then I thought, really? Was it weak, right? And it wasn't. It might have impacted somebody's life because I know how words hurt. And so I think I found something that I found shame in because I made that choice to do it, and I made the wrong choice in who to do it. I shouldn't have even done it to start with, right? Sometimes we are entertained by our own stupidity, and that is the truth. And it was an unkindness that I laid on somebody else. And what I had done is I used to manage a restaurant, and one of my servers, very nice girl, university student, just trying to make some extra money to help offset her tuition. I had heard something really funny. I thought it was so funny. Somebody said something to somebody, and they said, "Oh, you got the brain cells," or "No, you have the personality of an amoeba or a maggot." It was something like that. But I thought it was so funny. I wasn't woke at the time, but I did. And I was determined to use that. I thought it was so funny. And I chose this beautiful waitress, right? In a moment, I'd been waiting probably a week or so to use this and to get a few laughs, right? To entertain a few people, mostly entertain myself. And I used it on her. I says, "Oh, you have the personality of a maggot?" Oh, it was terrible. It was a terrible thing I said, right? I don't even know if anybody laughed. And in saying it, in that moment of saying it, the shame just hit me right away because I kind of thought, right? Even though I wasn't woke in that moment, I gave it a thought. What if that poor girl takes that into her life and she has to pedal over herself and do the dance and the show to entertain people like I did so often in my life, right? And her only doing it because somebody thought that, right, she wasn't entertaining or she didn't have a personality that was worth, I don't know, hanging with, right? That again, that I offered up something that hurt somebody, that made them feel that they might not have mattered. And that was a terrible thing that I had done. And so when I was digging back, that's something I always remembered, right? And that's another thing about shame. You'll always remember. And if I should ever bump into that girl, I would recognize her immediately because she was very pretty and she had naturally red hair and freckles and all. And she was lovely too, right? I hope she was strong enough. She probably was, right? To brush it off to the side and say, I don't believe that, right? That was a mean thing for her to say because it was a mean thing for me to say. And I felt very ashamed of that. Some people go, "Oh my goodness, you're right, Cindy. That's pretty lame. That's pretty lame." Yeah, maybe, right? Because I understand that there are people out there who have bigger things to be ashamed of. But, maybe they got those choices, and those were the choices that I made. And I had to choke down my choices. I had to turn the other cheek, even though I didn't always turn the other cheek. Um, I wish I had done less of that. I wish I had been able to hold my own, have a say, be heard. Um, I do believe I did step in and be that person on occasion, but it was only on occasion. And I should have known better, but I didn't, right? I didn't. And so we have to determine, are we feeling guilty about something or do we have something that we truly need to be ashamed of? I felt like I was ashamed of myself throughout my entire life. Like I said, I didn't wake up to these ideas until later in my life. But I remember, my mom take us out on outings and stuff, and I would always walk like 20 feet behind her or 20 feet in front of her because my mother was so like physically beautiful. Maybe not, right? But she was physically beautiful and she would dress us kids up and we would go out. Right? My sisters were all beautiful, and then it was the little chubby Cindy, right? And I was ashamed of myself. I was ashamed of being a part of that beautiful scene, which was my family, because all my sisters were beautiful. My mom and dad were both handsome and beautiful. And right, and there was Cindy. And I don't know how many times I heard the ugly duckling story. I eventually turned into that swan for a short time. I'm so grateful for that experience, right? But this is the conversation about the shame. So I was just giving an example. There was, right, and that was one of the things I looked back for in the shame, and I went, oh my goodness, no, that wasn't shame. I felt it. I felt shame. I think that was misplaced, right? Because there was nothing to be ashamed of. I was a part of that family, right? And I have no idea why that shame was there. I couldn't even say that it was guilt because there was nothing for me to feel guilt. I couldn't help the person that I was, right? And I was being, I'm sure, around my mother, I was being the best daughter I could possibly be. But it's funny when we look at the things that we've done wrong. That wasn't the straight and narrow. Even in our own thoughts, and when we're like, right? Because again, like I said, I wasn't quite often allowed to express myself, but in our heads, we could be doing that swearing and that yelling and that telling that person off in our brain, right? So I understand that our parents don't always get it right. Turning the other cheek was probably the worst advice that I could have gotten. I know it was expressed and projected onto me because of the person that I was. I was a little chubby kid. They knew I was getting picked on, and they thought maybe it would be a little bit less painful on me if I could just zip it and walk away. But it wasn't in my nature, and it wasn't in my nature for myself, and it wasn't in my nature when I saw it being done to others because I knew how I felt when it was done to me. So, right, I wouldn't uh, I wouldn't allow it to be done to others more, right? Turning the other cheek was a bigger problem for me in stepping into other people's situations than it was to step into my own situation. Maybe then I might turn the other cheek because maybe then my parents might be a little bit proud of me because I stuck up for somebody else. I stood beside somebody else. But sticking up for myself, that would have been a different story, right? You know, a lot of shame. I remember getting in those fights when I couldn't turn the other cheek and I would give the look or I'd hold a stance or I'd let out that exhausted, right? Like, and it would be noticed and I would be bounced on, right? And my mother had this pink dress, and it was something out of the 40s, right out of those old movies, musical movies, and it had the tulle underneath and the satin bow around the waist. It was pink, but it was no longer pink. It was so old. It had faded to gray, literally faded to gray. And whenever she caught me, whenever the school or anybody said anything about Cindy getting in a fight, she'd make me wear this dress to school for the entire week. That dress, I don't know if I grew out of it, but yeah, I'll never forget that. It didn't stop me. It truly didn't. I knew the difference between right and wrong, and I would always sway to the right if I possibly could, right? If I thought there was a cause, right? Like I said, I wasn't woke to any of those ideas. But going back today in looking for that example of true shame, I was hitting blanks on that. And I was determined it was going to be so easy to be on that topic of guilt and shame. But it was just one recognition after a next that I held a lot of shame. I held it. It wasn't necessarily mine. Maybe I held it for others. Maybe there was no shame at all. But in my own hypervigilance and in that feeling intent that, I put myself there so somebody else wouldn't have to put me there. And that could be a truth too. And looking back at it, is probably likely that something like that happened. I was very impressionable about that. And as I delve deeper and deeper, I get to recognize, right? And so maybe if you did the same thing in your own background a little bit tonight, take a look about those really shameful experiences that you had, those things that you went, oh my goodness, it just ruined my life and ruined somebody else's life, and oh, or you can't think about it, it eats at you. But like I said, sometimes when those ones eat at you, those are the true ones, right? So those are the ones that you can try to make a wrong right, or you can apologize, right? You can apologize for that, accept your role in that. But lots of times it's not shame. Lots of times it's guilt, and it's needless, needless guilt that we just accepted because, well, somebody said that that was just the way it was, right? I was really amazed today, right? And I'm sure because I know that there are things that I am truly should be ashamed of. And here's another one. I contemplated this one. This one was really close. But a big part of my marriage failing was the fact that I was a VLT addict, a video lottery terminal addict. Even though my husband said that wasn't one of the reasons that, that our marriage was not working. I felt that it was because it dictated that I wasn't home. I wasn't being responsible in contributing to the household, and especially when it was just me and him that we were taking care of. It should have been super easy, and it shouldn't have been filled with a lot of debt and stress and irresponsibility. And that's what it was. And it wasn't like we were a bad match. We were actually a very good match for each other. We came into our lives, each other's lives, in just the most perfect time, in a perfect story. And maybe it wasn't a happily ever after story in the end. Um, there were experiences in that I wouldn't give up for anything, right? Uh, it's something that, well, I know I would never have been able to experience uh, if it hadn't happened, right? But as fast as it came into my life, is as fast as it left my life. And some things are just not meant to be grasped. But I did think about this today when I was thinking about shame. And, if I had spent a little bit more time in that marriage, I thought, right, maybe my problems would not have rubbed in that relationship the way that it did. Um, and there were, right, there's always so many different sides to a story, and so many different ingredients. And even now, there's not a lot of those answers in there for me. I know if I delve into it, and that's part of the shadow work. We're not quite there yet. Those are the right, those hurts. That's going to take a lot of time. That's going to take some landscapes, sitting by a campfire all by myself. Right? You have to have that in that balance of our lives. Sometimes we have to have that little bit of sugar ready to take that Buckley's cough syrup and then get something really tasty in our mouths right after, right? It's a gain. I don't like mashed carrots and turnips, and at Christmas time my mother always made mashed carrots and turnips to go along with our turkey dinner and all, right? But we had to eat our vegetables. And the only way I could get it down was to mix it up in my mashed potatoes, right? And sometimes we have to do that in order to get the things that we have to get done that are difficult or distasteful, that we do have to mix it with the fun stuff, with the rewards, with the pep talks and the congratulations and the trophies and the money and right and yeah, guilt and shame. I brought that into my marriage, and I believe it was a part of the exiting of the marriage too, even though my husband would have said something a little bit different to the effect of that. I knew it true for myself because if I wasn't gambling, I would have been a different person. But it made me feel shame. I felt so shameful because I was spending money that was meant for the household, meant for our future, that I wasn't spending time with my husband because I was sitting in front of a video lottery terminal, and because I wasn't spending my time with my husband was spending time with his friends and right? And they in military, the guys drank, right? So he was drinking more, and he wasn't a big drinker, right? But he'd go on those binges, right, all the time, and we just separated in that way, right? We had growing out of each other's lives, and that's not to say, right? Like I said, it was the most magnificent time in my entire life. It offered up opportunities and experiences that I never had since, right? And I will never have again, right? I'm not going to say that, right? But will say probably, right? Never have again. No experience is ever the same anyway. But but it was time. It was time, right? And I didn't get to dictate it that. I would have fought for our marriage. I probably tried and cried, right? And tried some more, cried some more. And sometimes you can put every ounce of energy, every bit of heart, every bit of resources that you have into saving something, but it's not savable. And you know, I've learned over the years not to cry over spilt milk, to just let it go, right? If it comes back to you, it's yours. And that was a pretty tough following 10 years because that's how long it took us to finally just, that's it, don't ever call me again. 10 years of back and forth. It was not comfortable, but I did feel shame in my contribution to the breakup of my marriage. Yeah, we should be looking at the guilt and shame because we shouldn't be holding shame. Shame is a tough one. That's the admittance and the knowing of guilt, knowing our wrong, right? And if you really looked at it, you would see that it wasn't your intent, that it was an accident. You may have said something stupid, but there's always an opportunity to apologize and to make right in that, right? Yeah. Okay, you guys. We'll probably talk about guilt and shame tomorrow again. If I can have better examples in my own lifetime, because I know there are. And actually, I'm just thinking of another one right now, and I'll think about it a little bit after my live show when I come back in and watch it again. And we'll see tomorrow what we talk about. But I wanted to talk because lots of us, we beat ourselves up in that, and we shouldn't be holding that kind of energy because guilt, right? That's something that's just dictated, right? That's the judge calling, right? Guilty, right? That's your friend going, how could you, right? Or that somebody saying, "Oh, you stupid idiot," when they trip over you. And then we just like stumble over ourselves and we feel bad in that. But we have to stop and think, are we just feeling bad for the sake of, oh, I'm sorry? Like when we bumped into somebody, oh, I'm sorry, and take full blame for it. Here in Canada, they actually had to put a law in place that you couldn't use the fact that you said sorry to somebody, like in a car accident or anything like that, as an admittance of guilt, just because Canadians do that too much, right? That we don't actually uh, look at saying "I'm sorry" as something that is worthy of having the judge going, "Okay, you're getting three years," right? And all you did was kind of rub shoulders with somebody. Yeah, they went over the tracks. I shouldn't laugh. That's another bad example. Okay, you guys, I'm tired. I'm going to bed now. Everybody have a great night. It was a great day. It was beautiful. It was sunny. Me and my sister went out for the afternoon, right? Did a little bit of shopping and we did pretty good. We said no to lots of stuff where we could have made a little bit, and we said yes to a few things that will make us a couple $100. So that was pretty good. Okay, you guys, see you tomorrow.